The opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of Invisible Wounds or Wightman. Please be aware that the content of Fireside Chats with Deborah may contain sensitive subjects such as suicide, grief, violence, PTSD, and other mental health conditions. By discussing these subjects, we will decrease stigma, bring awareness, and hope. If you need support, please reach out to trusted contacts, family, friends, call your doctor, or go to the closest emergency department. Call helplines such as Boots on the Ground at 1-833-677-BOOT. We hope this series helps build self-confidence in you. On today's show, Dr. Christina Harrington, Life After Retirement. This episode of Fireside Chats with Deborah is brought to you by the Ayrshire House in Elora, Ontario. Welcome to the Ayrshire House. Refined and exceptionally welcoming, the Ayrshire House offers first-class accommodations in the historic village of Elora, where the beauty of nature blends seamlessly with the sophisticated small-town charm. The Ayrshire House offers beautifully curated accommodations fronting on the main street of the charming village of Elora. Featuring sophisticated designs and modern amenities, our 9 elegantly furnished guest rooms and suites are housed in 3 properties situated all minutes from the elegant Elora Mill and Spa, and only steps from the historic downtown and its stylish restaurants, upscale boutiques, eclectic art galleries, craft brewery and distillery, and spectacular eco-adventures. Find out more at www.ayrshirehouse.com.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure once again to welcome Christina Harrington.
Thanks for having me.
Christina, you've been with us a couple of times, either at a seminar or actually at 2 seminars, and done presentations. I'm very grateful. You are very skilled in your profession. You have a wealth of knowledge that you so readily share. You have a little sense of humor, which lightens things up as often needed. I wonder if you could maybe tell or show people where it is that you work out of.
I run a private practice group out of Hamilton, but we practice all over Ontario, virtually as well. So it's a company I started in 2009, and in our kind of later, more current years, we've focused mostly on trauma, bereavement, and loss, and so certainly my specialty area being public service personnel. So the company is Social Work Solutions Canada, and I know you wanted me to do a little dance, so I'll show it off. There you go.
So this series is once again talking about first responders, and I just want to make sure that the audience knows that what you say is quite applicable to other professions, correct?
Yep.
And that the topic that you're going to be speaking on today is retirement and preparing for retirement.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Is there, should we maybe start out with some things that you would suggest to people prior to the retirement, the actual date of?
Generally speaking, the longer runway you give yourself, the better you're prepared you'll be for that major life transition. We prepare for every other major life transition we go through, but this time we often fall short when it comes to retirement. And for me, I would advocate starting right from the beginning of your career, planning on what that's going to look like. And not just in a financial sense, there's certainly lots of measures you can take around that, but managing your overall well-being, particularly in public service first responder roles. There are heightened risks, both to physical and mental health. There's impacts on the family. So there's many, many kind of pieces of the puzzle that need to be considered prior to retirement.
So when you mention those things, I mean, it potentially brings up a lot of different subjects. So do you want to break them down into different kind of sections, maybe?
I will do my best for you, yeah. So I'm going to talk the least about finances because that is not really my wheelhouse. But I would certainly advocate for people talking to a financial planner early on. Many many individuals in these roles tend to live off paid duties and overtime. So, taking opportunity, especially later career, to live off your base pay and just get a feel for what does that actually look and feel like, especially if you're dependent on that extra income.
Do you think that people need to look realistically, not just the here and now and the gradual aging process, but looking at the price of services that are available and sometimes required? I think that first responders often get battered around a bit and have some physical health issues, and I think you thought about that or mentioned it to me prior to this broadcast.
Definitely. I think it's taking that holistic approach. So I think often when we think of retirement, we think about where we're going to travel and are we going to have enough money. But it's actually really, or neither of those. We're going to have no money, and so we're not going to travel. But it's really actually important to look at it holistically, particularly going into these roles. So we know that, for instance, there are a number of higher risks for health, higher cardiovascular disease, higher inflammation in the body. I could go into lots and lots of detail, but there are so many things that you can do proactively if you educate yourself throughout the course of your career, being, your advocate within the health system to make sure that screenings are done, just knowing the higher risks and being on top of them so that it doesn't impact your later years. We know that both mental health and physical health concerns escalate after retirement.
So can I just ask you something? When you talk about some of the physical illnesses or symptoms that could preclude a very serious illness, do you think that first responders are, one, aware of them, well educated around them, and accept them? Or do they just kind of compartmentalize them and pretend that it's never going to happen to them?
So if we're talking about physical health, first I'll sort of separate them if I could. I think there's a large lack of awareness. People don't know what to ask. People don't know that they're being impacted in these ways. Even though the research is there, nobody is providing the education early on to even allow for preventative measures. So for instance, when your body's in a fight-flight state, quite continuously, that is producing lots of cortisol and adrenaline, which I think most people understand that piece. What they don't understand is that that's at the expense of all of our other hormones. For instance, women will present to me, in midlife with anxiety for the first time ever, and it could be because their progesterone levels have dropped so significantly. We know, and most of the research is on men, that male first responders levels of testosterone drop much more quickly. And that's important because it impacts mood, it impacts cognition, it impacts weight, all kinds of things. So in short, I don't think that there is education pretty much at all. And so I spend a lot of time in my practice on that as well, kind of trying to take this holistic lens between, is there underlying factors as well as the mental health, because they obviously tie into each other. And so then if you don't have the information, you're not taking the proactive steps, right? And so do people accept it? I think once people can understand that we know that these things are impacted, this is just sort of my, let's call it clinical wisdom, they're actually quite grateful that these are avenues that I can explore to, not for a quick fix, but to help, improve my overall health.
And then when you're talking about mental health, you've got some newbies that are quite, no offense to anybody, I'm old with that term, new persons that are just either going through the training for their profession or actually right into it. Any comments around that?
Oh, lots. And we know historically the organizational culture has been one of shame, one where mental health is not readily discussed. Or again, I'm saying the same language, or is shamed, right? People often don't want to come forward, aren't talking about it, aren't sharing with each other the struggles that they're going through. I think we are seeing a bit of a shift in that, but it's a slow evolution. But, again, right from early career, making sure that when those hard calls come in, that you are talking them through with somebody, and not in an operational sense, but how you are emotionally impacted. When we witness these things, the part of the brain that processes emotion kind of shuts down. And over time, we have struggles with that. One of the things that we see as we approach retirement or after retirement is that all of those old calls that we maybe compartmentalized, to use that language, or didn't deal with, for a wide variety of good reasons, actually, can come to the surface. And it can feel like a bit of a floodgate. Often this can happen to you when, things start to feel quiet. So we're tending, we used to go. And some people actually struggle with that after retirement. The world kind of looks boring. But once things get quiet, stuff can come to the surface as well. What I generally find is that, it's not necessarily the work stuff that brings it to the surface. I'm not saying that it never is, but often it's when stuff crosses our personal bubble. So maybe you've had a death in the family, or a relationship breakdown, or a call that was just a little too close to home, right? That almost seems to uncork things, and lots of stuff will flood to the surface. And so being aware and almost expecting that that's going to be the case, and making sure that you have already, prior to retirement and hopefully throughout your career, established a relationship with a good trauma-informed, trauma-trained therapist.
Okay, but what about the fact that there's a number of first responders out there who are getting close to retirement who haven't done that? They haven't, either out of the stigma or sometimes the fear. There's so much buried inside, and they just don't want to uncork it because they're fearful, maybe. I don't know. I'm not there.
Yeah, for sure. That sort of sense of there's this proverbial like Pandora's box, right, that we don't want to open because we won't be able to close it. And again, this is where having supports that understand the culture, that understand trauma, that understand emotional regulation, right? You want to have some tools to manage your nervous system before you kind of dive in. It's not always possible. Sometimes our body takes us there. But really having all those elements in place when you're dealing with trauma, it should be paced to the individual in front of you, right? Not everybody can tolerate the same pace at the same time, right? And if you don't feel in control, you're going to feel further traumatized by that.
So you talk about self-regulation. Is that something that you need to expand on a little bit?
Yeah, maybe that's too much of a therapy term. The ability to regulate our emotions. So when we spend a lot of time in fight-flight, whether it's because of our job or just because of other stressors, that dominates the way we respond to the world. And the part of our brain that is in charge of regulating emotions, so not in charge of the strong emotions themselves, but in charge of kind of reining them in, is actually offline.
What part of the brain is that?
That's the frontal lobe. So here's my little brain, right? So if the back part is really entrenched survival, automatic, 6 to 7 times faster than what we sometimes refer to as our smart brain. And so these are our executive functions, our ability to take perspectives, ability to be rational, and ability to regulate emotions, among other things. And so if we're in this fight-flight space that's been reinforced over time, this is often not available to us.
Okay.
And so there's lots of strategies that you can learn to help, as we kind of say, keep yourself online, right? So that you can kind of keep one foot grounded in the present and still do the hard work from the past.
Thanks for explaining that. So when we go back to looking a little bit more about what people can do in prep for their retirement, is there other things that you wanted to expand upon?
I think, especially where there's families or partnerships, looking at that piece as well. We don't make major life transitions in isolation, generally speaking. And so where there is family involved or a partnership, really having lots of discussions. This is a major change in the household, right? If you're retired and your partner's not, are you going to be under each other's feet? If you're golfing all the time, is your partner going to feel resentful that they're doing all the work around the house and you're living the high life? I mean, having these conversations up front. How do you manage when that work brain won't shut off? And so I've heard this referred to as a number of, operational brain, work brain, kind of whatever terminology you like. But the things that served you well on the job, right? Black and white thinking, quick fixes, those things don't shut, hypervigilance, like being on edge, those things don't shut off, right? And what that shows up in the home is, if there's clutter around the house, right? Maybe somebody's getting yelled at if you're having a stressful day because, clutter and chaos in the environment, in a work environment is dangerous. In the home environment, it's not. but it doesn't shut off that easily. And then the family, where's the impact of that? Maybe you can't handle lots of people anymore. Maybe you don't like people anymore. I hear that all the time, right? So how do you go to social functions, right? Or when your worldview is different than somebody else in terms of what's a problem and what's meaningful, how do you interact with people? How do you go to a Christmas party? You know, behaviors that, again, served you well, you know, but if you go to a restaurant and there's nothing available, you know, to allow you to sit with your back to the wall so you can see the door, do you leave? Like, how does that impact the family, right? So there's so many of these things I think just have to be verbalized and discussed, and have a system in place to say, hey, this is coming up again and it's, you know, presenting a problem. Another one that I see all the time that I think most people aren't aware of, and it comes from lots of sources, but it also comes from being on the job for a long time too. It's sort of this sort of dual phenomenon, and we see it with trauma and it's tied often to tinnitus, so that ringing in the ears. The hyperacusis, so the brain turns up the volume on especially low repetitive sounds, right? So I can't stand you chewing, so I can't sit at the dinner table. So I can't be part of a family dinner, right? Or I feel that strong disgust. That's the other piece of it. They call it misophonia. And so the brain actually creates a nervous system, a strong emotion to some of these sounds as well. And so if this is part of your reality, because the way you've accommodated over time, that has significant impacts. So then how do you negotiate? Look, my nervous system's overwhelmed right now. I need to tap out. I need to go take a break.
When people retire, and we're talking about first responders again, that without the position of authority or of response, that basically relationships fall apart. You know, when you're at work and you can tell people what to do, expect them to do it, and they do it, and then they go home to a relationship where that's not happening. Like, is there any stats on how many marriages or relationships fail after retirement or during retirement?
Yeah, I would think there is a correlation. I'm not sure that we have the actual data. I can't say for certain. I'd have to kind of look into that and get back for you. Again, it's a very limited area of research. In the scoping reviews that are being done now, there's not a lot to pull from. But that makes sense, right? If you're used to being in charge, if you're used to managing your stress, right? I mean, even that dichotomous, like, it's this way or it's my way or the highway, right? Which, when you're having to manage a critical situation, you need to give direction, and it doesn't work so well in the home, right? And so I think, yeah, if you can't mitigate that, that for sure creates another problem. I think you also started to touch a little bit on this notion of identity, right? So I will hear many people say to me, I'm not this person, you know, I'm not, especially as they become jaded over the course of their career. If that happens for you, I often hear it with police officers, for instance. I don't want to be, right? Especially in this climate, right? I'm not that person. But identity is more than your job title. It's your meaning and purpose, right? It's why people signed up for these roles. They signed up with many signed up with a civic value, right? They wanted to give back. They wanted to do something. If you don't replace that in retirement, where's your meaning and purpose? We still have those values. Identity is about our social status. It's about how other people see us, not just how we see ourselves. And so that can be quite alarming when that is removed. You know, there's that whole phrase, 0 to 0, right? And I think many people really experience that. They start to feel isolated from their communities, not connected with, you know, peers that are maybe still working shifts. Many people, because of the structure of shifts, haven't built any outside hobbies or social networks, right? So it can be extremely isolating as well.
Sounds kind of depressing.
There's lots you can do. There's lots you can do. And I think the other thing too, that I think people tend to look back with their negative bias and pick out all the bad things in their career. And I would actually encourage people to look back and actually capture, whether you do it along the course of your career, keep a scrapbook, whatever that looks like for you, of the highlights, the good things that you did, that child you saved at the last moment, whatever, all those highlights that are why you do this, right? And keep track of that, because those get lost, and that's why you went into these roles.
That's a good idea. Yeah. When you're talking about family, what about the kids? You know, the kids are now grown. Relationships may be good or not good, or
Yeah, I mean,
dependency issues, all that kind of stuff that still may be existing.
Well, and I mean, so many people, because of the nature of these roles and inability to manage stress, or the stress carries over to home, I mean, often there's second and third relationships, right? So often you're blending families. So you may have kids in university and you may have little ones, right? So that could look very different for different families. And so, yeah, and if trauma is present for you, for instance, and you find you're irritated and angry and have no patience, how does that work? When there's noisy kids running around the house.
Yeah. I think what you're encouraging is a lot of open communication. And what I don't know, and I think I'm learning a little bit because of some of the seminars that have been hosted and things like that, about the relationships within families of first responders, is that sometimes open and honest communication is not really there a lot. There's a lot of, I can't talk, I can't share, yeah.
And those would be strategies you can learn. You can learn communication techniques. You can learn how to communicate differently, right? There's lots of different, therapies and strategies to open up communication, to speak from kind of a way that connects with the emotion, right? Not even necessarily the events you experience that day, so that people can feel seen and heard. And those can be developed throughout a relationship, to hopefully open the doors to this, to a rich relationship during career, but also afterwards.
How does somebody, now that they know that you're here and they've seen your t-shirt, but you're one service out of others in the province or in Canada, how do people access them? And what's it really like trying to access services? I mean, you're entering into retirement. If you haven't done all the prep stuff that you should have done or could have done, basically maybe out of a lack of awareness, I think, back then, because of what the culture was like. But here now, today, trying to get into services for mental wellness.
And that can be completely overwhelming, I would say, for anybody, especially post-COVID, right, where there are now so many providers. How do I even begin to choose, right? And so I'd say developing for yourself a short list of, do you know what things you want help with? Maybe it's grief, maybe it's trauma, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's anger. What are your areas that you think you might need support with? And people don't always know. And you can vet therapists. And I think, particularly in this community, you want somebody who's culturally competent. That's not everything. People come to me and they have real world, everyday problems like everybody else. But that cultural competency is often very important. And so there are numerous groups around Ontario and nationally that will provide lists of providers that have been vetted through those organizations as either having an evidence-based practice, having the cultural competence, having special skill sets. And so if you're looking for a way to shortlist, it might be talking to some of those organizations to help guide you. There are some organizations in Ontario that even have case management type programs that will really help you. But yeah, just sort of shooting at a dartboard is a little bit tricky. But even if you are, and even if you've narrowed it down to somebody who I would say for sure somebody who understands the cultural competence to some degree and trauma are really important. And interview them. Ask if you can do a consult. Not every practice does, but our practice does free consults. Fit is everything. There's research that's shown over and over again, it actually comes down to the therapeutic relationship more so than the modality that you're using. So fit is so important. Have that conversation. Interview the therapist. Try several sessions with one. And if it's not going, and I know people don't like this because they don't want to keep starting the process over and over again, but it's okay to say this isn't a good fit and try again.
Yeah, I actually have heard some people that have reached out, gone into therapy, and then been taken through the stages too fast and experienced a lot of emotional pain or fears of losing it, and so shut down and hesitant to go back again, which is really unfortunate. And so the fact that you're saying that some people are vetted, I think at one of the seminars, now I know Nick Helmsby was doing a presentation, and he kind of did this checklist, and there with some of the amount of skill sets that some clinicians have on their like on their LinkedIn page or something like that. It's like, oh my God, they're good at everything. And so you might want to watch for that when you're choosing somebody. But I think the fact that your organization does this, and I don't know, I would have to actually look around to see who else does, except, you know, if I want to refer somebody to somebody, like I kind of know how to do that, and it gets through, and it's a kind of a safe referral. But the fact that you guys do that interview or offer that, I think is wonderful.
Yeah, and it varies everywhere. I mean, so generally for social work or psychology, you don't need a physician's referral. For psychiatry, which is a medical physician, and usually more for medication management, that does require a physician's referral, right? So even understanding some of those ins and outs, so you could actually just pick up the phone. You don't have to go through your family doctor necessarily. The other thing that I do in my practice, and others may do this as well, is I always try to make sure that people understand the plan, why I'm doing what I'm doing. So here's what we're going to do, right? We're going to do some regulation skills first, because I want to make sure before we open up Pandora's box, we've got some tools there, right? And then maybe we're going to go slow based on whatever I'm seeing. But it's this ongoing conversation of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Yeah.
And that would encourage trust, I would think. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Any suggestions for individuals who have reached out? And what I'm thinking about is, I know some people that I've referred to, and mountains of paperwork. Took an hour and a half for me to do provide the information for an intake. 60,000 forms. 60,000 is the high number.
Which often causes overwhelm in and of itself.
Pardon me?
Which often causes overwhelm for public service personnel in and of itself. Enough to be like, I'm not doing this. Yeah. So, any comments about that? Do you think that's just the service, just trying to? Yeah, I mean, everybody has different practice standards and stuff. So, I mean, I can comment more on what I do, right? We have some intake stuff. It's not extensive. I find I do a lot more of that through conversation or even in session, or it's, you know, hey, I'd like to do some of these baseline measures. This is why I would do them. You know, is that something you'd be willing to do? And we'll either do it in session or I'll give people something to take it home. But I think I chunk it a little bit as opposed to sending out 60 forms at the beginning, knowing that causes in and of itself overwhelm.
If someone was coming to you or anybody within your practice and was seeking, what's the first thing that they would hear?
At our practice? The first thing they would hear. So they called like through the reception desk?
Yeah.
Just a little bit of, you know, kind of guidance in terms of, you know, what they may be looking for, maybe some discussion about what therapist strengths are what, and encouragement to book as many consults if they want, like free consults, you know, to get the right fit. Even when I get a new referral on paper, you know, I generally just send an email, hi, I got this, did you want to have a quick chat before we even book anything? Just trying to, as much as is possible, kind of make people feel as at home as possible. It's scary and it's hard to come into therapy, and so yeah.
Well, look, I want to thank you for being here and for sharing all that information. I know that we've touched on some things that are very kind of important for people to know, and I know that we've also touched on some things that might be a little uncomfortable for people to hear, but I think the bottom line for the message is around retirement, correct me if I'm missing out on things, is to start very early in your career and
think holistically. You have lots of domains in your life. Finances are just one of them. Health, mental health, not that they really are separate there, but I'll separate them here. Yeah, family or partners, social identity, right? How are you going to have meaning and purpose? Think broadly as you do that plan.
Yeah. And I think in conclusion is that, you know, you're definitely worth it, and everybody's worth it to go through the transitions in life with as least pain as possible, and we all need support with that. And so thank you very much for being here and sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Invisible Wounds will host events promoting mental wellness to first responders, their families, and civilians. To find out more, please visit our website at invisible-wounds.ca.